Hello, this is the Christian Idealism YouTube channel. I'm your host, Kyle Allender, and today we're going to be reviewing a blog post by this guy named Sebastian on why he's an atheist. Um, so, this blog post is, let's just say, very technical. Um, there's a lot of things that could be said on it. But I'm just gonna review it for you guys and give some of just a handful of my criticisms. I'm not gonna go by. It's not gonna be a point by point response because that would just take way too long. But I will say a few things about it, some positive, some negative, of course. As a theist myself, I disagree with a lot of what he had to say, but I also think that he presented a fairly good case for the atheist position. So, as you all know, Sebastian is an atheist in the philosophy of religion community. If you go on Twitter, he's known. I think his profile name is Panth. On YouTube, he's Naturalism Next, and of course, his first name is Sebastian. And he recently posted this very long blog on why he's an atheist. So this review is just going to be kind of like a summary of the points raised in that blog. And of course, I will provide some criticisms to what he had to say. But I'll also point out some of the things I agree with him on. So there's a lot that I actually can sympathize with Sebastian on a lot of different issues, and we'll get into those. Um, so his main thesis is that the total evidence. So this debate about God's existence, whether God exists or not, basically it's on the atheist side. That atheism is more likely true than not. And he argues this based on what he calls naturalism, right? So I'll get more into naturalism in a moment, but he argues that when you consider the total evidence, that it favors naturalism over theism, right? So Sebastian actually begins by laying out his methodology, right? What's the purpose? What's the purpose of his posts? Why is he doing this? Um, and he talks about how he's highly influenced by the work of Paul Draper. Now, Paul Draper, as you all know, is probably, I would say, the king of atheism. At least that's just my opinion. I know other people want to say Graham Oppy's the best atheist out there. Other people want to say J.H. Sobel is the best, atheist out there. People can have their opinions. My opinion is that Paul Draper is the number one. Um, After years of study, I found him to be the most challenging, at least for my sort of theism that I hold to. Um, so yeah, I do appreciate that. Like Sebastian does know the literature. He does know what he's talking about. This isn't like your typical atheist, like new atheist type of reasons why I don't believe this. No, this is something that needs to be um something that needs to be addressed by theists. That the arguments he makes in that blog need to be addressed by theists in the sense that theists need to have good responses, and I'll get into that near the end, um, and kind of expand upon that more. But that's just the first thing I want to point out, that it was very well written, and I will give props to Sebastian for his efforts in making this blog post, because even someone like me that's has studied the subject as much as he has, I could say that it was challenging to read that, and there was a lot of things I had to think through. Um, so I appreciate him, giving a sort of rational case for atheism, because I know there's a lot of theists out there that are going to say, "Oh, well, atheism is irrational. Here's my reasons." But honestly, I think I would disagree with that. I think that atheism is a rational position. I don't agree with atheist position, of course, but I do agree that I do think it's a rational position, that it can be rationally defended, right? And so that's sort of what Sebastian does. He basically presents like this kind of rational case for the non-existence of God, right? Um, Now let's get into what he had to say. So he first begins in his blog by laying out what's called Bayes' theorem, right? I'm not going to get into Bayes' theorem in this video or this review, but basically Bayes' theorem is a sort of way that we can judge what's called the prior probability and then the posterior probability of a hypothesis. Um, I don't know if I could show it on screen here, but basically it's this mathematical formula that you use to sort of, weigh two hypotheses. And so he begins by laying out Bayes' theorem. He begins by, laying out what's his method, right? And he, of course, he goes into what, one of the first things he goes into is like, what can we expect from theism? So if theism, if God exists, what are we going to expect, right? And this is when, after, he makes Bayes' theorem, and then he, points out, okay, what can we expect from theism? Then he goes into the evidence specifically. Now, the evidence that he goes into, he first lays out his case for naturalism, and then he addresses, the case for theism, right? So for naturalism, he lays out several different pieces of evidence. So the first one is the existence of humans. Second one is the cognitive science of religion. Another one is the success of naturalistic explanations. Another one is the dependence of the mind on the physical. And then most importantly, he also goes into the probable evil and suffering, how that's evidence for naturalism. And then he goes into the various issues with skeptical theism and theodicies. Then he also goes into religious diversity, the ineffectiveness of prayer, flawed religions, and of course, non-resistant non-believers, or the problem of divine hiddenness, right? I think that was. Oh yeah, I think I skipped over the cognitive. Oh yeah, and he also mentions the cognitive science of religion near the beginning, because he wrote another um, paper. It's like, I think it's like 60 pages or so, laying out like that argument. It's a fairly new argument. I'm not going to um, say much about this argument here. I'm mostly going to be focusing on the other stuff. But yeah, it's sort of, so he has his own kind of argument for naturalism that he's put forward as well, and that's kind of like a part of his cumulative case. So after making this case for naturalism, he then proceeds to respond to the evidence for theism, right? Um, he takes into account, he does admit that there actually is some evidence for theism, which I do appreciate. Like, I know there's a lot of atheists say, oh, there's no evidence for theism at all. But I appreciate Sebastian kind of realizing, like, no, this is wrong. Like, there is some evidence for theism. Of course, Sebastian thinks that the evidence for naturalism outweighs it, right? I would disagree with that. But he does think that there is evidence for theism, which is, I found really helpful, that there is kind of like these evidential chips that go into theism's favor, right? So he mentions fine tuning, he mentions consciousness, he mentions religious experiences. He also somewhat discusses the arguments from contingency, the PSR, and of course arguments from moral knowledge. So basically, he does his fair diligence. He does what he need, what would be the standard sort of case for theism, right? And then of course the last section in the blog, he then argues that um, when we consider the prior probability of naturalism and theism, that naturalism turns out ahead. So here he's relying on Paul Draper's use of coherence and modesty, and of course simplicity, and arguing that the prior probability of naturalism is going to be higher, and then when we combine that with the posterior probability, then overall the total evidence, right, ends up favoring naturalism, right? So that's the basic summary of what his argument, um, what his sort of cumulative case was. Now, there are some critical comments I want to bring to the table here, and these are, I'm going to try to be as brief as I can in these criticisms, but I think they're worth mentioning. So first is that I would push back against his definition of naturalism. So he defines naturalism as causal reality is fundamentally physical, and if any other order of causal reality exists, physical reality explains why it exists. Now, there are several issues with this definition that I have. So the first, of course, is defining physical to begin with, right? Without any understanding what the physical is, we can have no understanding of what physicalism is, right? After all, what does it mean to say that everything is physical as opposed to being chemical or financial or whatever, or any other definitions we put forward? So the point here is, fairly simple. Like, the pre-Socratic philosopher Thales believed that everything was made of water. Well, what does that even mean, right? And the problem is this. the physicalist kind of runs into the same boat here, which is, what do you mean by physical? With this understanding, we can say that we can't really assess naturalism as a theory without first defining it as a theory. Right now, this may not necessarily be problematic for Sebastian, but I feel like if we're going to restrict naturalism to a kind of physicalism, then we automatically run into these definitional issues, right? Now, of course, if Sebastian wants to keep his definition, I would say that this definition either runs into a circularity problem or straight into what's called Hempel's dilemma, right? For this reason, I will say that this definition that Sebastian puts forward is inadequate, right? Now, I do have my own definition of naturalism, and I'm wondering what Sebastian thinks of it. But basically, how I define naturalism, and I think this is the correct way to do it, is that there are only non-normative, non-intentional substances and laws governing change. If you want more information on this, see my last video on objective definitions of theism, naturalism, and axiarchism. So the point here is, if we understand naturalism as being defined as anything that is non-normative and a non-intentional substance and laws governing change, while this is consistent, I would say this is consistent with physicalism, is not bound by physicalism, right? So notice how in this definition we don't have any reference to the physical, which means we're not going to run into those definitional issues, right? So I think that this revised definition is a more appropriate definition for naturalism, right? So we can define, if we're going to, combine these two definitions, make the most sense of it, we could say that causal reality is fundamentally indifferent. And if any other causal reality exists, this fundamental, non-normative, and non-intentional, physical or non-physical, depending on which you prefer, substance explains why it exists. Now, the reason why I mention this is because if we go by the revised definition, then this affects more broadly his notions that theism is inconsistent with background knowledge, right? So he says near the end of his blog, quote, "Naturalism appeals to mechanisms that we perfectly understand in everyday life, the mechanistic laws of nature, and physical laws underlying the universe." Now, there are two issues that I have with this, and this does get into how we define naturalism. First is that in the revised definition of naturalism, it is not clear that we would antecedently expect an orderly cosmos on laws of nature that are fundamentally indifferent towards any sort of normative goodness. It seems that with indifference, there is nothing that distinguishes one outcome from any other outcome. Naturalism, thus, I would argue, relies on theism making false predictions, in the sense that because naturalism doesn't really make any predictions, and all we can really say is that some phenomena is more surprising on theism, and so therefore it's automatically in the favor of the naturalist, right? So this is kind of how Paul Draper sort of does it in his arguments from evil. Like, even if we may not, for example, even if we may not expect evil on naturalism, we wouldn't expect it on theism, right? So on that kind of argument, you know, then you could say, okay, naturalism makes a neutral prediction, and so because neutral beats a negative prediction or a false prediction, then naturalism, has the advantage here, right? So that's sort of what I would say that the naturalist can go by, but I don't think that naturalists can just appeal to mechanisms that we understand. And this gets into my second issue, which is that this is problematic for Sebastian because science is strictly confined to telling us about the behavior of matter, what it does. Physics tells us, for example, that matter has mass and charge. These properties are completely defined in terms of behavior like attraction, repulsion, resistance, electronic charge, momentum, etc. However, physics tells us absolutely nothing about what philosophers call the intrinsic nature of matter. So, what matter is in and of itself. Asking what is the intrinsic nature of matter is a metaphysical question and cannot be strictly dictated by the references of physical or, of course, scientific theories. Now, the reason why I mention this is when we understand this, examining what natural or physical means in a scientific context turns out to be ontologically neutral. Since physicalism as a thesis is about the fundamental substance of reality, and it's not a substance, it's not a thesis about physics itself, then you're going to run into problems by making claims like, oh, well, we can just appeal to the natural um, laws of nature in order to explain phenomena, right? Now, of course, some of you may be wondering, Kyle, what the hell are you talking about? Why can't naturalists just appeal to natural laws or physical laws? Well, the problem is that examining what natural or physical means, right, in a scientific context is completely ontologically neutral, right? And the problem is that physicalism is predicated on fundamental reality consisting of intrinsic formal properties such as spatial-temporal features, and that the relational properties has this intrinsic nature called physical, right? But the problem, of course, is that physics doesn't tell us this. Physics strictly studies the extrinsic properties of matter, not their intrinsic properties, right? In fact, if you want more information on this, I would refer you guys to the what's called the intrinsic nature argument for panpsychism. Um, but basically, physics doesn't support physicalism. Like, it doesn't by default support physicalism, right? It's consistent with physicalism, I'll grant that, but it's not necessarily doesn't like, oh well, the evidence for physicalism is just physics, right? Because when we start playing around with physics versus physicalism, physicalism is a very specific metaphysical thesis about the fundamental nature of reality, while physics is kind of like outside of that, and it strictly um, it studies what's called the extrinsic nature of matter, right? So that's kind of where I want to like push back a little bit on Sebastian's claim there. Now, that's not really the most problematic issue with this argument. I would say that the most problematic issue with the background knowledge argument is that there are forms of theism that are not inconsistent with background knowledge. For example, the work of Joshua Chijiwadi has shown that we can view God as what's called a metaphysical module omnipotence trope. And of course, trope theory is pretty well discussed in contemporary metaphysics. Now, this approach to viewing God as a trope is certainly an upgrade to Swinburne's own works because, traditionally theists have kind of dismissed the criteria of background knowledge. I myself have tried to do that in my previous videos. But here we can adopt this criteria and say that God, being a trope, is consistent with what's called our metaphysical background knowledge, right? Because, if you accept trope theory, then everything's made of tropes, right? Or it's, of course, or it's reduced to tropes. Now, I don't want to talk about trope theory because there's a lot of different views out there, but the fundamental point here is that if we view God as a trope, then this is actually fully consistent with what's called our metaphysical background knowledge, and it's not at all. It doesn't at all count against theism in that regard. I could say more about background knowledge, but I want to keep these critical comments limited. Next, there are issues with Sebastian's citation of Paul Draper on his, I think it's Draper's use of coherence and modesty in terms of, judging what's called the prior probabilities of naturalism and theism. So the issue here is that in the field of the philosophy of probability, much progress has been made to update Bayesian inference and epistemic probability more generally. The philosopher, what's called Nevin Papers, so that's his name, has specifically critiqued what's called orthodox Bayesianism, which is the view that basic probabilities are the unconditional probabilities of complete worlds. Klemhanga, in his work, defends what is termed explanationism. And so, what's interesting here is that Klemhanga's work directly goes into the heart upon the very method by which Draper relies upon. Right. So Draper's form of induction relies upon another philosopher named Bradley and Carnap, right? So I'm sure you all know who, for those that study probability, Carnap is kind of like, you know, he was a pioneer in the philosophy of probability. But of course, there are issues with Carnap's induction that Klemhanga points out in his work. And so the issue here is that if orthodox Bayesianism is the wrong view or the wrong way to look at probability theory, then Draper's arguments for the intrinsic probability of theism based on coherence and modesty don't actually work, right? In fact, Klimhanga himself has critiqued um, Draper's use of coherence in it's an unpublished paper called "Are Simpler Worlds More Probable," where he gets into that. So that's another line of argument that I could refer you guys at least in terms of the issues with Sebastian's claims here. Now, my next critical comment goes into his discussion on the defeat condition and the problem of evil. Now, what's interesting is that Sebastian is using defeat and compensation interchangeably, which is why he says in the article that defeat, if we apply the defeat condition, then that would make any logically possible bad states of affairs to be consistent with theism, right? So then theism basically becomes, some kind of unfalsifiable hypothesis. Now, there is a lot I could say in response to this section, but I want to keep my response brief. So first is that there's plenty of examples of things that are ultimately undefeatable. For example, the annihilation of the person. Annihilation in this sense is not merely just the death of a creature, but rather is a creature that dies and never comes back. There's no resurrection, there's no gap existence, there's no soul, there's nothing. That's it. It's the annihilation. Or we could refer to an indefeasible evil as an experience that is so horrible that it would be in principle impossible for even God to give a creature the opportunity to defeat it, right? Now, the examples here are not important. What is important, however, is that there is a larger number of ways or a larger number of conceptual ways by which there are indefeasible evils than defeatable ones. And the reason for this leads to my second response, which is that a defeat of evil is very specific, in that it would have to be an evil that not only would the creature have to be compensated, okay, so that's the first criteria, but also that the person who experienced the evil must come to endorse the events that have constituted their path to virtue. And so when you have this kind of limiting, not only does it have to be compensated, but also the creature themselves has to endorse or sort of embrace that suffering. This limits the amounts of evils that God is allowed to permit, and it certainly would be much more narrower than what naturalism has to offer in terms of explaining why there's evil, right? Now, more could be said on this point, but I would say that if theism has the capacity to, you know, defeat evil within its own value system or its own axiology, then evil cannot count against God's existence, right? So those are my other brief comments. Now, finally, I want to address something which is called the fallacy of understated evidence. Sebastian referenced it in his blog, and there's a lot of atheists online that also reference it because it came from Paul Draper himself. So the idea or the fallacy of understated evidence is the idea that the evidence for theism, when we examine it more closely, would actually be evidence for naturalism. So as an example, we could say that consciousness is evidence for theism, but that when we consider the fact that consciousness depends upon physical brains, then that would actually be evidence for naturalism, right? So that's kind of where the understated evidence objection comes in. Now, there's a lot I could say on this, but I will try to keep my comments brief. First is that there are ways that the theists can actually get around this. For example, we can say that consciousness is evidence for theism, in the sense that God would have a reason to create conscious beings. But more importantly, God may also have reasons to create embodied conscious beings. For example, Swinburne argues this. I myself have argued this point, at least within an idealist context. So I've argued that in order to have the kind of limited freedom and responsibility that humans have, then creatures would need bodies in the sense of being part of what's called a public space. A public space, of course, would require geometric forms in which there can be a real impact on the space, by which we can have a real, what's called moral. There's real moral consequences to our actions, right? Now, another thing to consider here is that when we talk about a public space, I'm referring to that as kind of like this geometric space by which you have, kind of like think of like a virtual reality or something where you have like all these people interacting. That's what I mean by public space. So you could be a physicalist, you could be an idealist. Doesn't really matter which metaphysical view you hold to. I just want to keep that in mind that when I'm talking about physical space, I don't have to refer to any of those metaphysical like presuppositions. Regardless, the idea here is that there are certain moral actions that we do that require a body, that require um, our minds to be dependent upon the body, at least in the sense if we want to like experience some real mental sensations. And so when we have this kind of what I would say a theistic narrative in the background, then we can understand that once the theist fleshes out the full context of the evidence of consciousness, then the fallacy of understated evidence is undermined, right? Completely. Now, of course, I would say we can also extend this paradigm of reasoning into other evidence, right? Such as fine tuning or moral knowledge or any of that other stuff. But the point here is that in order for the fallacy of understated evidence to be successful, the naturalist must show that the evidence for theism does depend on the evidence for naturalism, that the first order data, which is expected on theism, is overcome or overturned by some higher order evidence that some kind of theistic paradigm or theistic narrative cannot really explain, right? So in other words, you would have to show that the evidence for theism cannot be put within a larger theistic narrative or a larger theistic sort of paradigm of looking at things, right? Now, I'm sure that Sebastian would have responses to my criticisms, and hopefully when he does his blog as a follow-up, he can respond to some of my points here. But I also want to point out some of the things that I do agree with Sebastian on. So, as an example, I do agree with him that free will theodicies don't work. I also agree with him that skeptical theism is definitely not the right way to go, at least if we're talking the more extreme, right, forms of it. In fact, I would say that I don't know if Sebastian would agree with me on this, but skeptical theism, at least again, the more extreme versions of it are bankrupt basically as research projects because they don't really tell you anything. If you're just going to say that we can't know why God would allow certain forms of evil, then that just means your research project is dead at that point. So in that sense, I agree with Sebastian. At least at least in the sense that I agree that most theodicies don't work, and that most of the responses to the problem of evil are not good, right? So, for this reason, I commend Sebastian for his work on this. I also commend him that he, near the end of his post, he mentioned how he's kind of done with the philosophy of religion. And in some sense, I'm in the same boat myself. So even though I do kind of still study the philosophy of religion, my main focus is not that, right? My main focus is actually more recently it's been my research into probability theory, so looking into the philosophy of probability, right? And this is important because the philosophy of religion is connected to these other fields, right? So the best thing to do if you want to grow your understanding of the philosophy of religion, you kind of have to go outside of it. You kind of have to you know, extend like you kind of have to get out of a bubble basically, if that makes sense, right? Um so yeah, I mean I agree with him on that. Like I'm in the same boat myself, right? In fact, I would say the best way to move forward in the philosophy of religion is to precisely go into these other fields in the first place. So in that sense, I think Sebastian should do that, right? I think Sebastian, at least in terms of moving forward, should definitely go into other fields. I myself have gone into, the philosophy of mind, and I was studying that for many years before I went to philosophy of religion, right? So I commend him for that, right? As an example, like recently I have personally discovered many things in the field of the philosophy of probability that I would have never gotten from the field of philosophy of religion, right? Or, the intrinsic nature argument. I would have never known that if I had just stayed in the philosophy of religion, right? So there are definitely things in other fields that helped me. And I think Sebastian, I think he should definitely go into these other fields. Because the only way that you're going to move forward, the only way that you're going to grow your knowledge in the philosophy of religion is to go into other fields. So I commend him for that. And finally, I appreciate Sebastian's case because I see a lot of theists online make the point atheism is irrational. Atheism is stupid. Like, I think I forgot his name, but there was this guy that Sean McDowell recently had on where he basically said, "Oh, atheism is dead," or something like that. Guys, stop. Just stop. You guys, the theists out there claiming that atheism is dead needs to stop. Stop with the rhetoric, please. Just stop. And again, I apologize. Some people may say, why, Kyle, are you starting to go against the theists here? Because I see it all the time online, right? It's no different than the new atheist saying that theism is intellectually bankrupt. Just stop, right? And so in that case, then I appreciate that Sebastian has taken the time to make this case because it had to be done. Just because of the way that I've seen a lot of theists make comments about atheism or whatever. Right. Now, I don't know if Sebastian plans to write a book on this. I'm assuming he's not. But I will say that atheism, naturalism, whatever you want to call it, is not intellectually bankrupt. It's not a lost cause. Any rationally honest theist, anyone that has studied this, anyone that has read his post will understand that the burden of proof, if you're going to read, if you're going to read his post, the burden of proof is on you, theist, to defend your theism against Sebastian's challenging critique. Right. I've tried to do that a little bit here. Again, this isn't like a full-blown critique, but I would encourage my fellow theist to deal with what he had to say there, because I can honestly say it was probably one of the best cases for atheism out there. So anyways, thank you guys for listening. Thank you guys for watching. Have a nice day.